Okay, well, again, thanks everyone for being here today, and I'm very excited to present this paper. It's a new paper I have with Irina, who's here, and Pierre-Carl, who's going to be joining us later on today. And we're going to be talking about the quality of financial advice, in particular what might influence client recommendation. Okay, so I don't think it comes to a surprise to anyone in the room that the complexity that is faced by consumers nowadays has increased in terms of their financial decisions, right? There's been a big switch from DB plans to DC plans, and consumers need to make more and more decisions with regards to their retirement planning, whether it's their investment decision, their decumulation. And at the same time, as Ana Maria is going to talk about later on today, I think there's evidence that financial literacy in the population is quite low. Okay? Financial literacy is quite low, and there's an extensive literature documenting consumer biases in many different domains. So we can argue about whether we really think about those as biases or not, but there's people showing that there's self-control issues, present bias, the disposition effect in investment where people are less willing to sell their loser stocks and their winner stocks. There's the home bias, there's the annuity puzzle. So it seems like there's a lot of stuff going on with consumers. And again, Ana Maria has a new meta-analysis that shows that financial education can work. Okay, so financial education might be one way to help improve consumer decisions, but this knowledge might be costly to acquire, and in that sense, there might be some optimal level of ignorance in terms of your financial decisions. So maybe I don't need to know everything about insurance when I get an insurance contract, as maybe my financial advisor actually could help me walk through the details, and then that would be easier for me. So professional advice might improve individual outcomes. And indeed, financial advice is a big market. It's a $60 billion market in the United States. But as you maybe know, sometimes it gets a bit of a bad press. So we have papers that show that advisors tend to chase fees. They have misaligned incentives. They sell the product on which they're making the most commissions to their clients. Papers showing that advice is biased in some way against women. I think there's gender effect in the recommendations. And it seems like there are firms that have advisors that specialize in having advisors who are prone to misconduct. So if you look at different firms, there's firms with a lot of misconduct within their ranks and other firms. But even if we don't think that advisors are ill-intentioned or malicious, there's new evidence that shows that if you look at administrative data in terms of what advisors recommend to their client, it seems like the advisor fixed effect is really important. They tend to recommend the same portfolio more or less to all of their clients. And when you dig a bit further, you find that this portfolio is actually also the one they hold. So they hold a portfolio, they recommend it to their client, and then clients end up paying a high fee to get personalized advice, but in the end they're basically getting the same advice from the advisor as anyone else would get. So in particular, if the advisors themselves are prone to certain biases, they might just reflect these biases in the recommendation that they make to clients. Maybe they're doing this through recommending products that they are familiar with. This is a product I know, this is a product I recommend. Maybe I'm just projecting the biases to my clients. However, if you want to assess the quality of financial advice, it's actually not an easy task. You can't just go in the field and look at people who have an advisor and compare them to people who don't, because there's obviously selection there. Okay, there's evidence that people who are more wealthy, maybe more financial literate, they tend to have an advisor compared to those who don't. And then even if you could randomize advice to clients, there's always a notion of the involvement of the client. So the client comes in and he inquires about a particular product that might steer the discussion away from what would be optimal. Or on the other side of the spectrum, people who are not following the advice that their advisor gives. So you go, you see your advisor, gives you an advice and you don't follow through. So what I'm trying to say is basically it's hard to establish a counterfactual in the field when you go and try to assess the quality of financial advice. You can do audit studies. Some of them have been done. So you kind of have an actor who goes see the financial planner and tries to interact with them and tries to back out the financial decision. But in general, a real experiment where you would randomize things in a client advisor setting would be extremely hard to do, just because it goes against best practices for these financial institutions. So what do we do? Well, we do a survey for financial planners, and Glenn would call it, I believe, would call it an artifactual field experiment. So it sounds fancy, but what we're doing is, it's a field experiment because we're going to be interacting with true financial planners. It's an experiment in the sense that we're going to randomize, okay, some notions of the vignettes or the scenarios that we present to them, but it's artifactual in the sense that they're not making real decisions for real people. So we partnered with the two main financial planners organism in Canada, okay, IQPF in Quebec, because Quebec is always a bit different, and FP Canada for the rest of Canada. And one thing that we have to mention is that, you know, compared to the other papers that I just mentioned, these are not your typical advisors. Okay, for example, in Quebec, the IQPF guys, you need a bachelor degree in business administration or a bachelor degree in something with additional classes in business, a certificate with 10 classes in business. For the FP Canada population, it's a bit different, but you'll see later on that they're very well educated. 70% of them have a bachelor degree. So we're talking about high-level financial planners. So they're not CFAs, okay, they're not that good, but they're pretty good. And then we're going to look at how does familiarity, in terms of the product they know, they own, or they're licensed to sell, how does familiarity affect their recommendations in 4 different domains. So we want to see, across the board, different domains. We're going to talk about retirement savings, accumulation, long-term care, investments, and we're going to try to see if there's an effect of the products you know and what you recommend. Our survey goes as follows in the order. We ask them about demographics, we present them the scenarios, and then we backload the employment licenses, financial products, preferences that we gather from them. Talking with Financial Planners Canada, FP Canada, we are thinking about how much we need to give them for them to answer, and they're used to doing these surveys, so a few Amazon gift cards and some optional continuing education credit was enough to get some of them, at least 1,000 of them, to respond to us. So on average, the FPs are 50 years old. They have 16 years of work experience. They earn about $180,000 a year. And this sample, we can compare on some characteristics to the whole the FP Canada population. And basically, we're really, really close, except for the fact that they're a little bit better educated. Okay, they're a little bit more educated. And now I have to go back. It was worth it.
I'll edit that out of the recording.
They're also younger, less work experience.
A bit more work experience, about half a year.
No, it was negative. It's okay, it's okay.
No.
Negative.
Oh yeah, a little bit less work experience.
But you've got to say that you've only got 9% response rate. So this is Heckman would be rolling his grave if he was dead. That's
Yeah,
the
yeah.
sample selection issues. It's the unobservable, not
Yeah.
the observable.
Sure.
So throw that out there.
Okay. That's fine. But still. But we the thing we do is we randomize some variation in what we show them to vary the relative appeal of these products. Okay, so we're going to work with the scenarios and change the marginal tax rates of people in there. We're going to change the client health that we give them, the APR, in order to vary the appeal of the different recommendations, so that we're really trying to make it such that in different contexts and different vignettes, different products might be more likely to be recommended. We also change the name and gender of different people, client involvement, and compensation schemes. So what we're going to do is, typically we're going to present a scenario in which there are 4 choices which you can recommend, and we're going to run just a multinomial logic where the dependent variable is what the product that you advise is, and explanatory variables could be at the financial planner, vignette, or scenario, the domain level. And our main measure will be a measure of familiarity. Okay, so either you own the product, your spouse owns the product, or you're licensed to sell the product. And in all of these scenarios, we're going to tell them, you make the best recommendation as if you were licensed to sell all of these products. And it's kind of important because, at least in Canada, being licensed to sell a mutual fund is different than being licensed to sell an ETF or being licensed to sell insurance. So here's the pooled version of our familiarity measure. So I have different products here. And here I'm basically just asking, do you own it, or your spouse owns it, or are you licensed to sell it? So a lot of people are familiar with these products, but we do have variation in terms of the specific familiarity measure that we have. So for example, a lot of people own mutual funds, but not that many own annuities. In terms of your spouse owning the product, a similar scenario. And in terms of being licensed to sell, again, you have some variation there. Okay, so here's a typical investment vignette that we presented. So it's something like Kate, she's a 45-year-old female. She's a high school teacher. She has some income. And she has $40,000 that she wants to invest within her TFSA account, so tax-free. We're trying to rule out tax considerations here. And she has a time horizon of 2 years. And she inquires about investing in an ETF. And then, for example, in this vignette, the things we randomize are the name and the gender of the client, the fees that we're going to offer on the segregated fund option, the fees on the mutual funds, and whether the client inquires about a particular product or not. So here, the FP could reply, could answer either an index-linked GIC, a mutual fund, a segregated fund, or an ETF. Okay, so this is one of the vignettes. We have the randomized parameters, and we have other vignettes. The one on retirement is basically you have money. Do you want to invest it in a tax, a backloaded or front-loaded tax account, or do you want to repay your mortgage, or do you want to invest it in a universal life policy? There we randomize the marginal tax rates, we randomize the APR on the debt, and so on. We have one on decumulation, which again is someone who's a bit older and is thinking about how they can consume their wealth over the retirement. We randomize the name, the family situation. Do you have kids, yes or no? Do you have a bequest motive, yes or no? To elicit the annuity part. The health, expected returns on mutual funds, payouts on segregated funds, and they can invest either in a mutual fund, partial annuity, full annuity, or they can reimburse the mortgage. And the final vignette we have is on long-term care, and there what we really randomize is the health status of the client, the returns they can get on the mutual fund, the interest rate on the mortgage, and we ask them if they should repay their mortgage, invest in a mutual fund, or purchase the long-term care insurance. So those are the scenarios we show them. Each planner sees 2 of these scenarios where we choose the randomized parameters without replacement. So there's some variation within planners and some variation across. And here's the major thing that we find, that the one thing that sticks out from this research is planners in some domains, on some products, are more likely to recommend basically stuff that they know, okay? Products that they're familiar with. They're more likely to recommend mutual funds when they either have it, their spouse has it, or they're licensed to sell it. Same things for ETF or segregated funds for LTCI. But some of these products here don't seem to have this familiarity, this tendency to recommend something you're familiar. So annuities on the pooled measure doesn't have this effect. And one thing that we find consistently also throughout all of the scenarios is that planners who have a mortgage or have a lot of debt are less likely to recommend the people paying down their debt. Okay, so it's like they believe in being leveraged, and they believe in the effect of being leveraged. So this is the measure that is pooled, but again, there's some variation in terms of whether we measure ownership. Okay, so in the ownership measure, owning annuities, although it was a small part of the sample who owned them, really makes you more likely to recommend it. And whereas if you compare with being licensed to sell a product, being licensed to sell an annuity doesn't make you more likely to recommend it. So there's different layers of familiarity.
Sorry, your debt result is the same than the other ones, because if you have more debt, you're much more likely to tell the client to keep it with a lot of
Yes,
debt.
not to repay your debt.
Okay,
Yes,
so it's
exactly.
consistent with the rest of the results.
Yeah, exactly. Even though it's negative, it's still familiarity for us. Yeah. Okay, so if you look a bit more at each of the different scenarios, one thing that you find is as follows. So we have randomizations in the scenarios, and we're not saying that there's always an optimal thing to do or to recommend. Okay, I'm going to show you a few cases where there seems to be an optimal recommendation, but we're really more interested in knowing, do planners react in the ways that we think they should to these randomization that we should. And here I don't want to kind of cherry pick on results, because there's many randomization, there's many products, but here's a few interesting facts that kind of that go with these results. So in terms of the retirement savings vignette, it's a pretty simple question, because if you know the marginal tax rate when you're working and when you retire, you know if it's a back-loaded or front-loaded account that you should recommend. So in that case, there's kind of an optimal scenario. And it seems like if you look at our randomization, planners are really in line with what we would think. Okay, so if the APR on the debt is higher, then they're going to tell you to repay down your debt. If your MTR, your marginal tax rate when you're working, is higher, they're going to ask you, they're going to recommend a backloaded account, so you're going to actually have a high deduction because your marginal tax rate is high today. So these things are really in line with what we would think. But again, in these same regressions, when you look at familiarity, you still have the impact of product familiarity. So although they're making recommendations that are in line with economic intuition, this vignette is one where the only effect that you see is on debt. They're less likely to tell you to repay your debt when they hold debt themselves. And that's true for many vignettes. So I'll give you another example. In the long-term care risk vignette, having a client who's in bad health doesn't really affect their propensity to recommend long-term care insurance. But actually, when you look at planners who hold long-term care insurance, then you see a pretty big effect of long-term care in terms of familiarity. So there's clearly something going on in terms of advisors both paying attention to the scenarios that we're showing them, responding in terms of in line with our economic intuition, but at the same time being affected by familiarity. So in the accumulation vignette, a similar story arises. We find that they move away from partial annuities when the client is in worse health. Okay? And at the same time, they're more likely to recommend annuities when they hold annuities themselves. Okay? And these graphs here, you see, it's true also for mutual funds. If you hold a mutual fund, you're more likely to recommend it. Segregated funds and annuities. So there's a pretty strong effect of product familiarity in each of these scenarios. And same thing for the investment vignette. The investment vignette, they move away from products with high fees, okay, when we increase the fee. But at the same time, when you look at the recommendation in terms of familiarity, they're still more likely to recommend mutual funds when they own it, ETFs when they own it, and index-linked guaranteed. So there's really something there. Okay, so this is nice. What we would like to see is basically, has familiarity really influenced the quality of recommendations? Okay, and we have a few places in these scenarios where we can kind of talk about, I don't want to say optimality, but some scenarios where something seems to be more likely to be recommended. So I'll give you a first example. In our investment vignettes, we have mutual funds and we have segregated funds. And then we vary the fee on both of these products such that, if the financial planner randomly in one of the vignette has a case in which the segregated funds have the same fees as the mutual funds, because the segregated funds has more built-in options and guarantee, you would expect the financial planner to recommend the segregated fund. So in cases where the segregated fund kind of at least weakly dominates mutual funds, even in that scenario, you'll find that advisors are more likely to recommend mutual funds if they hold mutual funds. So this is one of the places where it seems like product familiarity affects the quality of recommendations. Another place where we can look at it is in terms of being paid commissions or not. So in the vignette, we randomize a prompt saying, oh, this mutual fund, you're going to be compensated for, it's going to go towards your commission, your sales, and all the planners are moving away from this thing. So when we tell them straight up, hey, this mutual fund, if you sell it to the client, you're getting more commission, they all move away from it. They're just showing us that they're paying attention, they're not going to do the bad thing. But when you dig a little bit more, and you're trying to maybe look at what they're doing unconsciously, well, you realize that in terms of being licensed to sell mutual funds, if you tell us that you're paid on commission and you're licensed to sell these mutual funds, then you're more likely to recommend it. Okay? So, so it seems like even though they're telling us on the big flashlight that we're putting in their face, they're telling us that they're not going to sell a product just to get the commission. Well, actually, okay, when you dig a bit more, you realize that these guys who are licensed to sell it, they're paid commission, they actually favor the mutual funds.
That's all following the economic incentives. In Canada, is there a requirement to respect the risk preferences and risk tolerance
Yes.
of the Canadian?
Yes.
So they're under some sort of expectation of
Yes.
doing stuff that they weren't told in the vignette, like what's the risk tolerance of the person?
Exactly. So there was no risk tolerance because we really want them to kind of give us what they would recommend without necessarily pointing them to this is the right answer or this is the wrong answer.
So they might make an assumption, your risk preferences are just like mine, and since I thought this was a good thing to do.
Yes.
So it may not be a bias at all.
So I didn't mention the word bias.
Yeah, you mentioned it a lot.
Not
No, you said it a lot, and you said it in the paper a lot.
Okay.
So,
But so one thing that to that comment is we have just a very simple measure of risk aversion, just asking them. So we didn't do NPLs, but we do control for these things in the regression. But yeah, so typically if you go see your advisor here in Canada, they first run you a big test to elicit your risk preference, and then they can recommend you something
They do a survey.
that's within that's within the box. Okay, so the third place where we have some optimality is in this first retirement vignette that I showed you, where we vary the marginal tax rate of the client when they're working and when they retire, and we vary the rate on their debt. And what I'm showing you here is cases in which either the RSP is optimal, so the back-loaded account, the TFSA is optimal, the front-loaded account, or repaying your debt is optimal, so when the APR on the debt is much higher. And again, you see that even when repaying your debt seems to be optimal, if yourself are levered, you have a high level of debt, well, you're less likely to recommend paying down your debt. So those are, let's say, suggestive evidence at least that your product familiarity might affect the quality of the recommendation that you make. We find not much effect of client involvement. So there's a big literature saying that the client comes in, inquires about a product, and the financial planner tends to follow through with it, and we don't find a lot of effect for that.
Do you know if it was optimal for the advisor to pay the debt?
So we don't have their own APR.
So in a sense, you still don't know whether they are biased or.
So the way we do it is we elicit we ask them their expected returns on typical index, and then we compare that with the APR on the debt in the scenario. So there's some measure of what they expect the index to make.
question.
Yeah, this is really not my field, but I'm a bit confused because in some ways, I'm not sure what it is that what your treatment is. And I know you're randomizing a lot of things and you only have 40 minutes. But in some ways, I would want you to randomize that for the advisor, not necessarily that for the hypothetical client.
Which we cannot do, right? I can't randomize.
Right, but then I'm not sure I understand how to read the results.
Yeah.
And
it's mostly what we know about you, what you hold. How does that affect your recommendation? Where we know that what you hold is kind of endogenous.
It's totally endogenous.
Yes. But there's this randomized parameters where you randomize the appeal of the different product, hoping that you're gonna move away from your own familiarity.
But for instance, in the example of debt, you're saying the client has so much debt and the interest rate is so much in the market?
Yeah.
Is that, so you
Yeah,
kind of,
exactly.
you say
That's where
imagine
we
that
end up.
inflation is
So
this
here-
as opposed to
so
what it
here
is
in-
really?
In this case, you have different APRs for the debt. Sometimes it's high, sometimes it's low. In cases in which it's really high, it's more optimal to repay your debt. What we find is an advisor who would have debt themselves will just.
But this
will
was
be
done
less
when? When was, so you don't randomize the current and the future inflation?
No, that was last year. So that's a good point. Last year, the
Okay.
inflation was
Okay.
maybe less of a concern.
Yeah,
Yeah, on the debt piece, you're randomizing the fees for all the other products.
Yeah.
There really isn't a fee for an advisor if you take $1 million and pay off your mortgage instead of putting it in the market. So you're making an assumption that since they have debt, they're biased towards it, but is it also potentially the incentive that they don't make money if the client goes in that direction?
It could also be, yeah. But the place you find it is when they hold them, the debt themselves. But it could be that for all the clients, they don't want to recommend the client to repay on their debt because they prefer getting.
And do you make that comparison if you don't see the same thing if they don't carry debt themselves?
Yeah, but I mean, those are what these graphs show. So basically, I'm looking at whether you hold debt yourself, yes or no. So that was so that's comparing basically that's comparing advisors who hold debt to those who do not. That was it.
And you may be holding a lot of debt because as an advisor, you don't want to pay a stupid advisor to tell you what to do because it makes money out of it.
Right.
Okay, so this is kind of the evidence we have, and we don't have a lot of like optimality results, and this was not the intention of our survey. And there's not much effect of client involvement. So there's a literature showing this, and I can show you there are some statistical effect on the ETFs. So if a client comes in and asks about ETFs, then you're more likely to recommend the ETF. And here it might be about, if the client asks about ETF, it must be that they know what they're doing, they know it's lower fees, but still this is the only place where we see the effect of client involvement. And we find very, very limited effect, okay, like no effects of gender. There's some marginally statistically significant effect where you're a little bit less likely to recommend a mutual fund to a female client, a little bit less likely to recommend universal life, but really nothing big is happening there. And finally,
Sorry, on this gender, why should we expect an effect, or
No,
other studies have found an effect, or I mean?
some studies find effect in the recommendation that we make across different genders in terms of having biased recommendations for women. Sometimes recommending, like this is more in line with the literature, we're going to recommend less mutual funds because it's more risky to women. But here, I think the null would be that you don't see any effect, which is mostly what we find.
And the advisors are mostly men, I guess. Any message?
I think 30% of them are women, 36% of them are women. So we also looked at the pairs of a women advisor advising a women client, and there's really nothing there. So the interaction of both, there's really nothing there.
No, it's the same question on
Sorry.
the gender of the advisor.
Yeah. So we did these things, but there's no effect. And finally, across all scenarios, we can kind of pull all the returns that we show the advisor. And what we see is there's kind of a bell shape where the advisors are not going for the mutual funds that promise a 10% return. They mostly go for the mutual funds that promise like a 5% return, a bit less for the 6%, and so maybe they think about risk when they recommend these mutual funds. So this is what I wanted to talk about today. So I'm a bit early on time, but so what do? We investigate familiarity in financial advice recommendations, and basically we survey financial planners in Canada. These are high-level advisors, and what we find is recommendations are mostly in line with economic theory. I think that's the first order effect. But then familiarity seems to be important, and even for these high-level financial advisors, but it varies across the domain. Okay, so in retirement savings decision where the optimality is a bit clearer, there seems to be less effect of familiarity. And we think that we see some evidence that product familiarity influence the quality of advice. So I think taking stock of this is, well, if financial literacy is low and financial education is costly, there's a need, or potentially a need for financial advice. But if advisors have themselves biases and they're just projecting these biases onto clients, you end up having clients who pay high fees to get biased advice from a financial advisor. So maybe that raising awareness of these potential biases could help reduce their prevalence. And to that effect, FP Canada is kind of taking this research seriously, and we'll have a new module about just thinking about unconsciously recommending different things to different people, in which they're really going to talk about familiarity and trying to elicit these things.
Perfect, thanks. We have to discuss in 15 minutes, and then we've got plenty to discuss. I've got a long list.
Thank you so much for having me here. This is my first time at this conference. I did not know discussions were supposed to be meaty, so I've made some notes to add to this. But surely this room will offer you lots of advice. So I have to say, you sent me the paper, and then I was Googling it later because I thought maybe you've done other work on financial advice and I wanted to find it. And this person keeps coming up. He's very well known. Not you, but I think you should connect. He seems friendly. He has a lot of blog posts on this topic, so that was interesting. But what your paper teaches us, at least to me, not doing active experiments a lot, is that an extremely well-run randomized RCT in the space is possible. And I think that was really interesting to learn. There is this 9% response rate, which I think I just came off teaching my undergraduate students about non-response bias and all these things. But one of the things I tell them is that, because many of them say right away that, I show them a survey like yours, for example, that'll have 9%, and they'll all say, that's the problem, 9%. And I tell them you'll be very disappointed in the real world if that's your standard, right? You're probably not going to get very high response rates. So I don't think that's in itself a problem, but maybe helping us think through some of the selection on who responded and what types of omitted variables might we be concerned with. Like, this is not particularly something about where we might worry about busy people not responding or something. So maybe it's people with fewer clients responding or something, but maybe that itself is not a problem. So I didn't think that itself was a huge problem, and I thought this was quite impressive. The other kind of methodology that you didn't quite highlight, but I thought was interesting, is that it's not just a field experiment with different advisors, but also it's a setting where you have these vignettes which carry actually, in a way, correct answers, right? Like you artificially create an environment where you give them enough covariates in these vignettes that the advisor should do a particular action most of the time, and then the idea is to compare the action taken against what they probably should do to tease out some of these biases, as you call them. And I think the main takeaways, as I figured, I didn't summarize too much of the paper. I'll get into this a little bit, but I figured it's early morning, you've all paid attention. So, he finds that people seem to favor the familiar products. They seem to respond to client recommendations and vary advice, maybe just a little bit, it seems, by gender in the paper, and respond to compensation. So, given that this is a real-world experiment, I was curious about, what is the extent of financial planner use in Canada to begin with? And it seems like it's about 4%, right? So the reason this is important, and for me at least, I'm thinking about your paper, and this could be wrong, right? I don't know, I got this, the sites are here. But it's important in thinking about from the planner's seat. The general person that sits in front of them is a quite selected group, right? Probably highly educated, probably on the wealthier side and so forth, because it's a relatively rare thing to seek financial advice through these planners in the first place. So just as a backdrop. So what are the 4 different biases that the authors try to tease out? The first is this client involvement bias, right? So what does this mean? Basically, are planners more likely to recommend their own, or are planners more likely to recommend things that the client themselves comes up with? The finding is that they do. But I think in terms of interpreting this, as I think Glenn already suggested, right, it's difficult to think of some of these things as biases rather than maybe information, right? Particularly if they own these products themselves. this, could be some kind of perceived unobserved fit, like you're suggesting a product for yourself. Only 4% of people seek advice, so probably these people have researched this a little bit to begin with. Maybe their own suggestions are not so bad. But also it made me think a little bit about like this challenge that comes up in other settings. So when I was searching for this, just trying to learn a little bit more to help offer feedback, it seems like the other area this comes up a lot is in the medical decision-making literature, where doctors are sometimes prone to listening to patient ideas, and it's a challenge for them. So there's some really nice review articles that I think you could link to about how doctors deal with this situation. Like a patient comes in there, clearly there's an information asymmetry, like hopefully in the financial planning space as well. And then I think there's not huge takeaways, but the takeaways are just that this is a challenge. You can put a lot of information to help overcome it, but it's not easy when there's lots of unobserved fit to decide whether or not you take the patient's or client's recommendation. The second one was gender bias. And I think broadly you don't find much, but at least in the paper it seemed that one of the strategies was that they put in basically a dominated product and saw whether or not financial planners were more likely to recommend that dominated product to certain groups of people. And they seem to be finding that women are less likely to be marketed that dominated product. So the dominated product is universal life insurance, which doesn't make sense if you have capacity and some other instruments to save. If you have those instruments, you should not be saving in this product. That's why it's dominated. And that was really interesting to me, that if anything, you're finding some positive gender bias in the sense that they're not recommending a bad product to these women. So I was wondering about, just generally who goes into financial planners, right? It's maybe they're clearly doing an experiment, but it's difficult to separate what you see in real life from what you see in these online settings. A woman coming in alone for financial advice, as they are in your vignettes, maybe somewhat rare, maybe that person is more educated. So just kind of thinking through how we interpret the sign of some of those biases. The third one was about planner compensation. Again, I don't think of this maybe as a bias, but just as a response to this incentive. The way they've done this in the experiment is they've added sentences like, for example, the sale of mutual funds contributes towards your compensation. And they find that you do have a lower likelihood of recommending at least an exclusive portfolio carrying the thing that you're compensated for, which is interesting, right? It's not just a linear, like, okay, now I'm going to max out on whatever you've told me. So there's something about maybe trying, given that it's randomized, it's interesting that they do that, right? So are they trying to appear trustworthy to the experimenter? In equilibrium, I was also curious if clients just know about the fee structures and how we should think about these findings. And finally, I think the fourth one, what you call familiarity bias, basically are planners favoring products that they or their family owns, particularly their spouse, or that they're licensed to sell. They do find this, and I think here again, it's not clear whether it's bias or if these individuals really just believe these are good products. Maybe they have unobserved fit to them, their subjective beliefs into the future that they might hold. It's also not clear, I guess, from an ex-ante perspective about are there many possible optimalities? And so different planners have different fits that they then try to replicate for their clients. It seems like we're coming from an assumption that that cannot be optimal, but is that true, right? Given the similarity across instruments, I wasn't totally sure. Another thing that I was wondering is if there are some products, and maybe you've dealt with this already, like let's say like a broad stock portfolio that's a diversified market product. If many people have that product, should you not consider it? Like, should you demean by the most popular products because those may be just good products? So maybe you want to focus on products that are not very common, but that the planner is anyway suggesting. I don't know. Here I was also a little bit curious about how you thought through multiple hypothesis testing in a way, in the sense that these individuals hold many different products and then you're finding that they are more likely to recommend maybe half of them, but how do we think about, out of a set they're more likely to do half? I know you've thought about it, I just couldn't quite follow. And that's just some additional reactions. There's a lot going on in this paper. That you have these vignettes, and I think it's the right way to do it. I think as a consumer, it's maybe a little bit difficult to follow all the different manipulations. So you might want to have like a table or a figure showing exactly what marginal thing you're changing in each experiment. So there's lots of additional interesting results, like planners with less confidence in their own advice are less likely to recommend products that they're licensed to sell. I found that a little bit unintuitive, but I'm sure you have an interesting hypothesis that I couldn't quite tease out. The paper carries these multinomial logits, which are clearly a right design in some ways, but because they're hard to interpret, and this is like the bad econometrician in me, right? Could you get away with doing something simpler to make it a little bit easier to absorb? I don't know.
Please don't say do well or less. You're not going to say do well or less.
Yeah, no, exactly. And then finally, you have at least, I think, 20% of French speakers. This is just fringe comments, but but maybe I was wondering if there's any difference maybe by language. And just kind of coming back to this idea that these vignettes in some ways have the structure of the right answer, but the real life application of these advisors is to operate in a world with lots of gray space. And so how do we kind of think about that that validity? And I think that's one of the things your paper gives us a lot to think about. And so I think that's mostly what I have. Yeah, I thought just kind of small things as you were presenting, it came to me that you do the name experiment, but you also, like, instead of saying Kate is a 45-year-old teacher, you say Kate is a 45-year-old female teacher. Things like, are you using in a way the name variation, or are you just giving gender and making that salient? Things to think about. But overall, I really liked the paper. I think the word bias may be a bit tricky in this setting, but trying to tease out the endogeneity of some of the different things I've mentioned would help absorb the paper's many findings. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, so my question is about these effects of familiarity on quality, right? Because I think this is sort of the main goal of the paper. And to me, at least, these scenarios look like they have a lot of moving parts. So the place where you were talking about the effects of familiarity of quality was the segregated funds versus mutual funds. Are these the same funds with the same performance, the same fees?
Yeah, so I think we said, in both cases, we say think about a general index such as the S&P index, so that it would be the same underlying mutual fund. So there was no differences other than.
Okay, so that's the place. So there are two funds, and both of them are index funds, and they have the same fees.
Yeah, one is a segregated fund, one's a mutual fund.
So what is the segregated? What can be the segregated?
Oh, so it's an insurance product where basically some of your capital is guaranteed. So there's just more guarantee on what you can get back than a mutual fund, which usually would come with a higher fee.
But you have the same fees.
Yes, it's something at where we randomize the fees. So we have a fee structure for the mutual fund, a fee structure for the segregated funds, and then in some randomized scenarios, it just happens that both have the same fee.
And
then
they should recommend the segregated, but they recommend the mutual fund if
when
they
they
have
own
neither.
it. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, got it.
So that's
Good.
Can you say a bit more about the market for financial planning that these people are operating in? Is this like the middle segment? Is this a high-end segment? Who are you selling to?
So we.
Did you find any difference between Quebec and
Okay, so that's a good thing. So we have a lot of information on them. So in terms of what licenses they have, what kind of places they work in. We haven't explored all of these things, but we do have information on, like, do you work for a bank, a big bank, your own? Are you self-employed as a financial advisor? Do you have other certifications above and beyond? So like, I think there's maybe 2% of CFAs in our sample.
you could actually use a lot of information to the data.
Yeah, we could dig in more. We could cut the data more. So we were feeling we're cutting it already, but maybe at least controlling for these things could be a good idea. But yeah, we have more information on patterns. That's right. Yeah.
So I think the big question is the own portfolio bias here a bad thing? So taking that one step further, the question is, are the financial planners themselves holding the correct portfolio? Right. So you mentioned a little bit during the presentation that you don't want to say too much about the optimal portfolio, but then based on the discussion, it seems like in the paper, maybe you do. But it seems like you can, for most of the vignettes, take a stance on what is the correct or the most optimal. Now, it would be better, of course, if you had questions about risk preference, But it seems like the starting point should be, you know, what is the optimal portfolio that they should recommend?
Yeah.
And then starting from that, how much is a departure based on what I already hold myself?
Yeah. So there's not that much optionality because we didn't want to we wanted to have their opinion in a sense. So it's not like in each vignette, in each randomization, you have something that's optimal to do.
Let's just stick on this point for a moment, if we may. There's other questions.
So just so for that, I understand what you mean about the financial planner, but when you say that economic theory has a prediction, do you push that more in the paper? Like, do you look at some kind of optimizing framework and say, from the perspective of a fully rational household, this is what they should choose? Or?
No. It's really just about, you know, if the returns on the mutual fund is higher, we have 3 different returns that are randomized. Do you move towards these higher returns? If the APR on your debt is higher, we have 3 different randomized rates. Do you tend to recommend paying down the debt a little bit more?
No, let's pick on this if I may, because the paper literally, the way people lust after, journals lust after the word bias. Your paper is replete with the B word, and it uses the optimality word. They don't have a formal model of it because that would show that they don't know risk preferences, they don't know longevity risk, they don't know beliefs, they don't know time preferences, they don't know intertemporal risk aversion, and a whole host of other factors. But you do use the O word, optimality, when you're talking about it, because this is a vignette that has an optimal. Now you have some qualifiers, but you know your oral qualifiers are not what's in the paper. You're flogging the bias in the paper. So that means you must be flogging that there's some optimality.
So that to that point, I totally agree with you. And my presentation, we're moving towards we're moving towards reducing these optimality, the wording of optimality and the wording of biases. I think
so. On that,
I think that's a fair.
Given the amount of information you have in the vignette, you can do something. You can take a stance on what you think the average coefficient of risk aversion is, and then maybe play with that and say, well, unless your coefficient of risk aversion is 20, then this recommendation is super not optimal. But for some of the things,
there could be bounds,
so I think that because you have so much information there that you could discipline a model in certain ways, even if you don't know time preferences, because you can look at other papers and say, well, for the reasonable range of time preferences, this is always a dominating portfolio.
There could be bounds. I think that's a good.
Or give the reader a better sense of, you know, if things we didn't ask, what might explain this is not being popular, and then we'll come back to it.
Yeah, I don't know if this question is a bit off, but in your last slide, you say that because of the biases that consultants, offer, the product they're familiar with, there's policy consequences that the government needs to address. You need to think about the counterfactual. So the people that go to these to seek advice, if they don't seek advice, what would have happened?
Oh yeah.
And if what would have happened is, well, it's sitting in the bank or it's in a worse place, then it's not clear that those familiarity biases, as you call them, are.
That's right. That's a
then they might not be optimal, but they might be better than the alternative.
And that we don't see, right? We don't see in this non-advised.
But I don't know if the literature knows much about, what people do if they don't go to the advisors, and maybe you can get a back of the envelope.
So you have papers that compare people who are advised and not advised, but again, you have the same kind of problem with the self-selection. So I understand. I don't think it's an easy question, but maybe the way we frame our result, we should be a bit careful in thinking about that.
So I was just thinking about your result on similar advice given to both genders and how to reconcile this with some of the other papers which have found differences. So is there a concern that maybe these responders, even if they were to give different advice, they wouldn't report it to you because they know that as a researcher you might be able, there's a reputational cost because you would be able to judge there.
So there's always this issue.
The respondents for taking an exam.
Yeah. So I like to think of it as, I think they're on their best behavior. It's FP Canada who's sending the email. It's kind of their employer. So that's why, if you do find results on the familiarity and their tendency to recommend familiar product in a context in which they're clearly on their best behavior, they're responding to our incentives, they're responding to everything we're putting there. So in my sense, it just strengthened the result. that they really tend to recommend stuff that they're familiar.
You want to say bias. I can hear you. You want to say no, let's be blunt. You want to sell a paper. You want the paper to go to a top journal, be bias. You're going to hear it coming out. I mean, this is a fundamental point here. Just like when you started off, and this will be a theme we have throughout, you said, it's well known that financial literacy is low. Bullshit. Compared to what? Compared to what counterfactual? Compared to what normative metric? Let's just not say things like that, you know, I'll demand people sort of say, what do we mean by low? But you had a question back.
I was going to make a similar point, like as a policymaker, right? What do we make of these results? And I think the question is, what would have been the alternative if they had that?
Yeah.
And so I think it's a little bit related to these kind of information experiments where you kind of randomize some kind of information set to people. And I think the kind of frontier is to actually see what people do in terms of like research design, right? There could be a next stage where you try to observe what people make of these, what the treatment effect of the advisors itself, if they actually change their behavior, and if that's better or worse, and to what extent they can mediate information that they get. And that's one point. And the other point was related to the paper by Gregor Mackles and co-workers, who find that there's like a lot of advisor misconduct in the US, and so like what they find was important is actually this kind of advisor and client matching. So like the quality, right? It's again coming back to this post question, like what do we make of it, right? Is advice good or bad? Are people better off or worse off? It seems to depend on which advisor they go to. So it's kind of shifting, and so this kind of like I think that's where the vignette is a bit that's kind of not captured, right? Because you have this people person, and that's the mutual selection is not the matching is actually not.
No, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. This we can look at, but so I think in the literature what you see is there's two-way matching. The advisor tends to advise clients that look like them, and the client tends to go to an advisor that looks like them, which we don't have this year. That's right.
I have one question about familiarity. Like, I understand that familiarity bias in other settings could be a problem, but in this very like in this setting, do we want financial planners to recommend something that they're not familiar with? Like, just thinking about the optimality or not optimality, but
I mean, so if I go see an advisor, let's say, if you think about license to sell, and then here we told them, you know, act as if you have the license to sell all of these products. I don't know, do you want to go see an advisor and get a mutual fund because he's not familiar with ETFs? I don't know. I don't know if that's the right thing to do.
yeah, but I think that if we just assume that financial advisors are imperfect and well, people with imperfect knowledge, then there is, you know, just as if you think about the implications, well, what do we want from advisors? How do we, you know, are there biases that we want to correct? We just have to be very careful about, you know, like if we just assume that is improved, like of course, ideally I would like to have a financial advisor who has perfect knowledge, but nobody does. And so if there are certain things that they don't know, then it may actually be a good thing that they're not recommending something that they are neither licensed for, nor own, nor have in their family. Like maybe that's actually not a bad thing. But it would just be a qualifier for saying.
I think a general point you're making, and many of the comments are making, is the paper starts off actually as let's be descriptive about what we found, but that will not go to any journal you want to send it to. And that's just like the advisors are responding, they're not being malicious, they're responding to the economic incentives that they're facing. So you started off saying they're giving bad advice or they're malicious. No, they're responding to the economic incentives, so are you. So the problem is the moment we start making normative claims, because this is a vignette, as distinct, just let's clarify here, there's a term Gary King has popularized called an anchoring vignette, where you ask people a question and they rank, and the options are rank ordered. It's used to calibrate survey responses to words such as, there are key words, how do different people compare the word happiness, for example, take a tragic case. We all mean a different thing by the word happiness, but with an anchoring vignette, we can compare the results. This is not one of those, so you are relying indeed on being able to identify better or worse responses. I think if you do that cautiously with the right caveats about explanations, you can get to the normative stuff, but it's just too strong and bold and naked if you just do it. I think that's the general.
That comment is well taken. Very well taken.
I have a general comment, if I may, because this is going to come up repeatedly we're in an audience here that likes to do surveys with a randomized control and call them experiments. Let me just make a semantic point and then I'll make two substantive points. We usually use the word experiment, I do, for stuff which has real incentives, rewards, money. I don't care whether it's small or it's large in the field, that's not the issue. Incentives. Survey, hypothetical. Yes, I fully understand, I'll say it again, if you've randomized something, you feel like you can call it an experiment. If you call it a survey experiment, that's fine. If you call it an experiment, you confuse a lot of people. I'm just saying that. Now, two substantive points that follow from that. The first is sample selection bias. We got 9% response rate. Okay, and Anita's completely right. That's quite normal in these sorts of things. One of the things many people have done, and we've actually followed ourselves in Denmark, the one thing you can control is the participation fee. Now, they had a lottery, which everyone got the same lottery, and I don't know if they told them the terms. If you vary that, now we're often interested in eliciting people's risk preferences. If you vary the guaranteed participation fee from 0 up to $500 or something like that, guess what? You've got an instrument for a sample selection correction. Because if you give them a guaranteed fee, the more what will happen, they'll participate depending on their risk aversion, which is one of the key parameters we're actually interested in. So even though the rest of the survey is purely hypothetical, you've at least got an instrument. And we should never start showing pictures of my gender mix looks like the population. Like I said, it's as if we're in a world, a counterfactual, where Heckman didn't exist. It's not the observables. It's not the observables. It's not the it's the unobservables. So don't show me those pictures. They mean literally nothing in terms of sample selection. I know they make referees go away, but that's just bad. The final point I want to make, though, is about hypothetical bias. One of the things you did, which was a pity, there's a large literature that says to mitigate hypothetical bias in surveys, this is stated preference experiments, many of us know these a lot, if you add a none of the above option, or do not respond, you get a lot closer to the the observed behavior, okay? So in other words, conditional on someone saying, so very often if someone says, none of the above, they're so unfamiliar, they're not familiar, but conditional on them actually, you only gave them 4 real live things. You didn't say none of the above, which is another way of saying maybe I'm not familiar with it, I'm just guessing at things. It turns out, and this is a happy result in terms of hypothetical bias, you can at least claim that the conditional on saying something is in fact close when they've done careful comparisons to revealed preference data to the actual revealed preference. It's too late if you didn't do that. But it's one of these things, no, I'm just saying if we're going to do surveys and we're going to randomize them, which I love, and I like these use of vignettes as distinct, so there's nothing wrong with that, it's just distinguish them from the anchoring vignettes. Let's at least do them better to be honest about that. Now, you may not want to tell referees that it's hypothetical, you may want to hide that, but that's not.
I don't think we're hiding that it's hypothetical.
Yeah, but I think there's a lot of papers here going to use the word experiment without qualifiers, so I just wanted to get that.
Okay, so
in
you're
there.
setting the bar for the next. In any ways, thank you so much for your comments. Honestly, this is.
Well, we still have another minute or two. Any other questions?
I wanted to just say one thing. Yeah, they are very clear. It's a survey experiment, but I just want to say, like, hearing the discussion, there really is a lot of overlap with the medical decision-making literature and the familiarity bias too.
Yes.
It just made me realize, like, there's all this fixed effect of doctors on, like, whether women have C-sections or whatever. Like, I think if you link to that literature, there's more of an objective truth that people clearly depart from, so the bias is more obvious.
I know that you're.
So, kind of, like, I thought the gender and the familiarity ones were the most clear biases compared to the other two. So.
There's also a large literature, and we have some experts here on precisely this. In the US, they're required to ask questions about risk tolerance. The problem with risk tolerance is it congeals risk preference from risk perception.
Right.
Doesn't tease those apart. It's actually about as useless as you can imagine. I think the really exciting area to go here, this is not saying what you've done isn't exciting, it's just saying it's another direction, it's just saying let's look at what's actually being elicited by these sort of surveys of risk tolerance and to what extent they actually match risk preference. There is some work there, particularly when you start getting into annuitization, retirement things. The question is longevity risk. Is it beliefs that are wrong? We have a lot of evidence from incentivized belief elicitation about actual longevity risk that people get that wrong. But far more importantly, we know the confidence about their beliefs. By confidence, I don't mean like they do in the finance literature, optimism. That's actually the wrong use of the word. I mean the variance of their beliefs. How confident are they about those? That, of course, plays dramatically into the products that should be recommended. Any other final questions? And is Lou here? Yes, yes, he's back. Good. Okay, excellent.
Awesome, well, thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for your time.